Hello everybody, good afternoon. It's welcome to our 7th webinar in our HR series, Managing Flexible Working this afternoon. So I'm Karen Penfold, I'm the Head of HR for Code. And thank you so much for joining us today for this 7th webinar as well. Hoping you'll find it really valuable. So we're going to look at first the aims and objectives for the webinar today. I'm just going to run through those, which is to increase an understanding of the correct process for handling flexible working requests and to help managers comply with employment legislation. The objectives today we are looking at to discuss an overview of employee rights relating to the flexible working application process and to highlight the risks of refusing a request relating to one or more of the specified reasons, which I'm going to run through later. And also we're going to look at to explore how our Code Total HR service provides useful policies and template letters to help practices comply with their legal obligations. So the learning outcomes for today's webinar is to potentially avoid those costly mistakes when refusing a flexible working request, to improve understanding of the benefits of implementing flexible working, and to understand statutory employment rights related to flexible working applications. Okay, so quite a lot to go through. So session content, what I'd like to cover in this webinar, and I'm conscious we've only got the lunchtime period, we're going to look at the employer's duty, the legal duty, what your obligations are relating to flexible working requests and better understanding of that. We're going to look at benefits and barriers for employers, what you come up against and why certain areas that you're not keen to implement flexible working arrangements. We're looking at the actual process of handling requests, right from when you receive one through to potentially having to refuse a request and the risks associated with that. We'll also explore some common mistakes to help you to avoid, look at useful policies and templates as well, and how important it is to get the right advice at the right time if you are unsure at any stage and there is a potential risk there. Okay, so quite a lot to get through. So when we think about flexible working, what exactly is it? In essence, flexible working involves employers making adjustments to their preferred working arrangements to accommodate their employees' preferences. Now, it's a bit of a mouthful there. I think it has quite a little bit of a bad press. Quite a lot of employers feel that it's very one-sided and it's more about what the employee wants and not about the employer. But really, it's supposed to be there, and it's to be both parties. It's a proposal that an employee puts forward, and it needs to be agreed, and also from the business perspective, and not just about the employee's preferences. So the reason I was really keen to do this particular topic in the webinar is because with the dental profession still being so heavily, it's dominated really by a female workforce, and still the majority of flexible working requests that we receive are from women, and even in 2019 they still have their main carers responsibilities. So I think it's very relevant to dental practices, and I am pretty sure, 100% sure, that majority of you that are here today are either have some kind of flexible working arrangement in place or going through a flexible working application at the moment or have done in the past. So I think it's particularly relevant, and I think it will help you in managing them going forward. So why should employers consider flexible working in the first place? Now, I'm going to touch on what the legal obligations are and, of course, why you have to do it legally. But on top of that, there's some other real positives of doing it. I think, number one, society has changed massively in the last few years in how people approach work now, with no longer the sort of the 9-to-5 culture. And I think it is about moving with the times. And if, as an employer, if you are thinking more flexibly, you're more likely to appeal and attract that sort of diverse workforce, and which will then fill your skill shortages as well. And particularly with Brexit, Marco touched on that a moment ago as well, we don't know what's going to happen there. There might be further skill shortages coming up. So it's really about embracing, I think flexible working is actually going to be the norm in the future, and it's becoming more and more like that at the moment. So we know with the millennial generation that we're currently in the workplace and recruiting, their expectation is that they should be able to work flexibly and pursue their outdoor interests as well. So it's thinking about those areas. Also, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the phrase sandwich generation. The BBC actually did a section on this earlier in the week. And this is the actual generation where you've got people in their 30s and 40s that have carer responsibilities for their elderly parents and also their children, and they're sandwiched between that. So you could be missing out on a whole area of skills there if you're not an employer who's able to work flexibly to accommodate those. So those are other reasons to consider it. But actually, from a legal point of view, employers since 2014 in June, this was brought in as legislation. So the employer should consider flexible working applications in a reasonable manner So it's the consider, the reasonable manner. They should respond to a flexible working request within a 3-month time period. And that includes the decision-making time and any appeal stage. They also have to, if they refuse a request, it has to be for one of the specified business reasons. And I'm going to run through those a bit later today. So those are the obligations for an employer's side. Now, an employee has to have 26 weeks continuous service to be able to make an application under their statutory right. And they also can only make one application in any 12-month period. So a lot of people are familiar with that. Some employers are waiving the 26 weeks time period, and again, to attract and recruit, are letting them apply straight away. So that's something to think about as well. Okay, so let's think about the barriers in place, why employers don't want to put flexible working or even consider it. Now, I'd say on the phone, actually, we've had a couple of calls this week where I've spoken to practice managers who have received a flexible working request. And the first thought is, what is this going to cause me in terms of workload? If I accept this request, that means I'm going to have to accept all the other requests that come through, and where's that going to leave me? It is, I think, a barrier there in terms of operationally how you manage flexible working. If you've got lots of people on different working patterns, it can be a real nightmare in terms of training, communication. And also there is a worry from an employer how they meet the customer satisfaction side if those consistencies aren't there. Additional costs could arise if you're having to take agency staff on or recruit to plug those gaps that aren't covered. And also grievances do come from other employees. And I think I talked to a member the other day who was really worried about the effect it would have on other employers, other of her team members, if she was to grant flexible working to one of them, and then what the impact might be. So there could be moans and groans there, or them thinking that they have got more work put on them, which could result in grievances. And some employers see that as a barrier and don't really want to go put themselves in that situation. There's also, this does mainly come from managers or businesses in general, the resistance to change, to not wanting to embrace how working and lifestyles are now with the work-life balance. And because something's always been done a certain way, is to do not want to change that either. Or they've had a bad experience of flexible working arrangements previously, and this has put them off implementing it again. So lots of reasons there. But on the other side, the benefits of flexible working, I think, far outweigh the barriers there. And number one, again, to be a flexible employer and your recruitment, you're going to attract more people, a more diverse workforce as well, if you embrace flexible working. It's already shown through surveys to have a really positive impact on retention, your staff retention. If you can show as an employer that you're willing to negotiate with them and embrace any of their flexible working requests, again, if it can work for you in the business, then what you will get in return from your employees is they want to stay with you. They're also, you'll see increased loyalty and morale, job satisfaction can go up as well. And actually, generally, health and well-being is proven to have a big impact where stress levels have gone down, your absence and sickness rates can be reduced, resulting in those cost savings. Also, if you're retaining staff and retaining those skills, you won't have to recruit so much. So you'll be making some cost savings there. I know it sounds a bit cheesy, but also you can quite often, if you've got a happy team, happy workers, it'll be more productive, and also happy customers can come on the edge of that as well. So another real positive that I think people don't always realise is if an employer is flexible, quite often that can rub off on the employee being flexible. And they're more likely, if you want to put through other changes in the business later on, more likely to accept change if you have already embraced and implemented their requests as well. Okay, so let's think about types of flexible working. Now, I've structured this slide very much on the types that I know in practices that we see, that we talk to our members about. Number one, obviously, is part-time, going from being a full-time position down to reducing their hours and putting a request in to go to part-time. Now, part-time is anyone in your practice who doesn't work your full-time equivalent. So full-time workers work 5 days a week, and you have someone doing anything less than that, even if it's 4.5, they would be considered part-time. Under part-time is also job share. And Alex and I had a bit of a debate about job shares the other day. His experience is that they rarely work. I've seen some really positive ones and arrangements in place, and I think they can do. It would be interesting later in the Q&A if you want to share any of those experiences as well. They can work very well for practices, and I know predominantly they can be in your receptionist roles. So 0 hours, again, they get a bad press, but they can work very well for both employer and employees. And then on top of 0 hours contracts, you may have variable hours working. which is where you provide them with set hours, but they can work them flexibly. You see flexi time schemes is another one that quite often in corporate settings. But one I see quite often that comes up in practices is term time working, which can work very well. So it means your employee will be taking all of their leave during the school holidays and only working for you during the term time, which can again work quite well. Not many people realise that just requesting, an employee can request a change in location is considered a flexible working request. And those of you with multiple practices may have an employee come to you who's perhaps moved, or their children are now going to a different school and they wish to change location and move to your other practice. So that would be a flexible working request that comes up. You also, we've seen a big increase, and I don't know if people are starting to travel more, that could be an aspect of it. But requests to take sabbaticals from work come under the flexible working requests as well as career breaks. So lots of different types. The NHS in particular, they have a self-rostering system as part of their flexible working arrangements, which is a software system that many of the nurses will go on and pick which shifts they want to do. So again, lots of places embracing different types. Okay. So common reasons for requests. Let's have a look at this. And again, being in the dental practice and with predominantly women that you have there, you're still receiving types of requests that are for childcare reasons. That would be the number one reason that flexible working request does come up. Returning from maternity, for example. But it's not just childcare. They could be caring for elderly parents or disabled child, or any of those types of reasons. Religion is another one that we're seeing an increase for flexible working arrangements. And that may even mean that they just want to be able to attend a religious festival once a year. It might not be a permanent change in their flexible working arrangements. Now, disability, not many people may realise that if someone has a disability, they can make a flexible working request under reasonable adjustments in the Equality Act to help to accommodate that. So, for example, we've had a case recently where a member has a nurse that's been diagnosed with MS, and they have to change their working hours to accommodate this as a disability, so to do shorter days. So that would come under this arrangement as well. Also, requests come up to go and pursue those types of interests. It doesn't have to be a subject that's anything to do with their employment. It may be people just want to go and explore something completely different altogether, and they can put that request in. Hobbies and interests, charity work, all sorts of reasons that people may make a request. And it's actually not even about the reason. They don't even need to tell you the reason that they want to change their working arrangements. Where it does come in is if it's for childcare, religious purposes, or disability related. It's good that you know that so that you can minimise that risk of a discrimination. But people can make requests if they just want to be able to walk their dog in the morning, for example, or attend a gym class, or they're just not morning people and they'd rather start a bit later. So it's all sorts of reasons there. So what happens when an employee actually makes a request? Now, I'm going to use the example, the most common example, because I want to make it relevant very much to you and your practices, is we'll quite often receive a call from a member who's telling us that they have received either an email, a verbal request, a text message, or WhatsApp seems to be quite popular, from an employee who's returning from maternity leave. And she's saying, I want to come back on such and such, and I'd like my hours to be this. And quite often we'll speak to the member and they'll say, oh, we have to do this, don't we? What do we do? And actually it's advising them that, no, you don't have to immediately accept. It's following a process. So the first port of call is to look at your flexible working application policy. Now, those of you with iComply, see quite a lot of you with us today. I'll run through where that is in iComply later. I'll give you the reference number. But the first thing you need to do with any employee who's requesting or making wanting to change their hours, is you give them the flexible working application policy. Now, it won't just protect you. It will make sure, obviously, that you're following your legal obligations and following the right process. It also makes sure that you're being consistent and fair. And if you are in a situation where their request does not work for you as a business, working through this process will make it safer for you if you are in a situation of having to refuse and turn down their request. So it's laid out in this policy how important it is, what the employee needs to provide to you in writing. So verbally over the phone or text message and everything else does not cover that, does not meet the application requirements. So an employee, when they write to change their hours, they need to state in there that they are making a statutory request. They're exerting their right to make a statutory request to change their hours. They need to state the date they're making the request. They need to outline the changes that they want to make. So, for example, person returning from maternity leave who wants to change from working 5 days a week to working a Monday, Tuesday, and a Thursday morning. They also need to say, and this is the bit that quite often gets missed out, they need to show that they've thought about the employer here, that they've looked at the business aspect as well and what the impact might be on the employer by asking for these arrangements and these changes and any solutions in that. So on top of that, they need to also make it clear whether they've made any previous applications in the last 12 months, because obviously it's only one per 12-month period. And also they need to state in there when they want the arrangements to start from. And going back to the disability situation a moment ago, if they are making it clear that they are asking for a flexible working arrangement that's related to a disability, they need to make that very clear in this statement and application that it's for a reasonable adjustment. So it's quite a lot of things that you need an employee to actually state in their application and to make it realise that the key word is here that they have a right to request, not a right to demand or a right to actually have it accepted. There is a process to follow and it's a proposal that they are making. Okay, so now you've got the flexible working request. So the employee has followed the application and you're aware that they would like to come back in a couple of months' time and change their days to Mondays, Tuesdays and a Thursday morning. So what do you do next? I would advise familiarising yourselves also with the application process, because you need to make sure that you're working in that 3-month time period, including a decision time, and also have a read of the ACAS code here. It's a set of principles which will also support you in your legal obligations. So the next step is to not delay in responding to your request. So you would arrange a meeting with the employee and ask them to come in, and they can bring a work colleague. They do have a right to bring a work colleague as part of your policy. And in that meeting, you're not there to make a decision there and then in the meeting. It's literally to discuss their application, talk about the proposals, consider what they have said, but also put to them your concerns. For example, it may be, well, my concern with a Thursday, if you finish half day on a Thursday, that's one of our busiest days in the practice. I'm quite concerned about where that will leave us in the afternoon. And if the employee comes up and say, well, I thought about that and actually so-and-so would be able to cover that, or we could do this and give you different options there. So it is a two-way thing where you're talking about what they would like. Again, they don't have to tell you the reason they're making the request, but it's better if they do. And it's working together to kind of come to a solution. When you're considering the application from them, so you would leave that meeting, taking on board everything they've said and your own thoughts of how it could impact the business. Now, the assessment criteria, and I think this is quite a difficult area sometimes because every business is so different. It should be objective business criteria that you're looking to make your decision based on. So it has to be around what works for the business, and that may be, are there any cost implications? For example, if you were to grant this particular employee, what would be the impact on those Thursday afternoons? Is it going to cost you more money? Would you have to get agency staff in, for example, or pay other staff to cover that? That may be a cost implication. Or you may think, actually, no, we have got enough staff to cover that area. What about the patients? Will they be affected? As the quality and performance, customer service, any issues there? And the days, Monday and Tuesday, that the employee wants to work, am I going to be overstaffed there? Is enough work going on there? So you would look at it against this criteria and what works for the business when you're making that decision. So your options are, once you're considering the request that they've put forward to you, is you can either agree, compromise, or refuse their application. So hopefully, if you're in a good position and you've looked at your business criteria, or that actually this could work really well, we've got enough cover on Thursday afternoons, for example, there's no issues there, we'll be able to absorb that. So the next step is for you to agree this in writing. And unfortunately, this is an area that employers forget to do, and it can come back to bite you later on. So you confirm in writing the new arrangements, and then it's the amendment to their terms and conditions of employment. So this is the key part. So we have a template on iComply, which I will refer you to later, which is subsequent changes to terms and conditions. And that needs to reflect the change in their terms and the date that this is taken effect from. Their service shouldn't be affected at all. Continuous service still remains, but you probably will need to recalculate their holiday, for example, and then make those adjustments. Now, when someone makes an application under flexible working and you've agreed that, that is a permanent change to their terms and conditions. If you haven't got all of this in writing and followed the application process to support that, there could be an argument, if you were ever in a redundancy situation, that the employee could insist that their redundancy calculations were based on their full-time hours and not their amended hours. So those are the reasons to think about making sure that everything is reflecting that. Okay. So the compromise option, I have to say, this is probably my favourite option when dealing with flexible working, because it really does put the onus back on the employee as well to think about what they can do, how their what an alternative is to make their requests, their flexible working requests work for both the business and themselves. Because going back to it being a proposal and not a demand. So I know some employers will receive those and think that they have to accept it. So you can go back to them and say, okay, we've looked at this, we've had our meeting, we've considered everything you've said, but we're quite concerned that the Thursday morning is still going to be, you can do that, but we've got a bit of an issue on the Thursday afternoon. We feel that is our busiest day. So how about we suggest, can you do a Wednesday morning or a Friday morning instead? And it would be coming back with alternatives to meet the business as well. Or it could even be that you find Tuesdays and Mondays aren't going to work for you. They're not busy enough on that period to warrant the full-time work there. And you can move it around and come back with suggestions backwards and forwards. It's really important as well to, instead of an outright no, this is not going to work, if you have a suspicion, going back to the Thursday afternoon example, that it may, a gut feeling it may not work, but you're not quite sure, is to do a trial period. This is best practice and it will be in your favour. If anything ever went wrong and it did go to a tribunal, it looks good if you have at least tried to trial it, not completely dismissed the idea. If you are going to do the trial period, again, make sure it's in writing, that you've confirmed it's for a temporary period. And I would recommend that you look at doing this for about 3 months and have a review after the first month. Make it clear that it is a trial period. It's not a permanent change to their terms and conditions. And you'd have the right to revert back to their original working pattern if this did not work out for the business. But then you would go back through your flexible working application policy and meet with them and probably end up refusing the request. And we'll talk about that in a moment. It is a tricky area if you get this wrong, particularly if they are under one of the protected characteristics, which I mentioned for sex discrimination, maternity, disabilities or religion. So please do get advice if you're in this situation. So if you've gone through the compromise stage, but it's still not going to work for you, and actually your gut feeling is, looking at it from a business perspective, that this is not going to work, it's actually going to affect the business in a detrimental way, you have to refuse the request in line with the specified reasons. So there are 7 specified reasons. These are listed in the application, flexible working application route as well. And also it's better to not have one of those reasons. You need at least 2, and I'm going to talk about those in a moment. So it is confirming to the employee that unfortunately, despite the discussions and they're looking at the options to trial it or compromise, it is a refusal because it's not going to work for the business and meet both sides. So it's confirming that in writing to them. But I would suggest before telling them this and just giving them a letter, is actually to have a meeting with them and go through your reasons for having to decline and refuse the request. So it's not just going to be in a hard letter. So it's confirming it in writing and also giving them the option to appeal. So they usually have 5 days to appeal that decision. There is, not many people probably know this, there is an ACAS arbitration scheme available purely for flexible working requests. It is voluntary for employer and employee. There are risks with using it, an impact on where you can go after that. So if you are looking at using that service, please, I would advise giving us a call first so we can talk you through the options. Okay. So the thing with refusing a request is this is where your biggest risk is if you get this wrong, in terms of not just the process, but because of the risk of discrimination claims. And again, going back to the predominantly being women coming back from maternity leave or with childcare responsibilities that are asking for flexible working, you have to be really, really clear that you have considered it carefully and reasonably. So specified reasons, now these are linked to your business again, and they are laid out also in the ACAS code. So they relate to, I think the number 1 is burden of additional costs. So for the example of the employee who's put in a request that she would like to change that working pattern to the Monday, Tuesday and the Thursday morning, is you would look at, okay, Thursday afternoons is going to cost us a lot of money in terms of we haven't got enough staff there. We're not able to reorganise the work among the existing staff. So that's another reason that your refusal is there. They're already stretched, and we would have to get an agency staff, or we could potentially be at risk. If anybody goes off sick, we won't be able to meet our patient demand. So there's several reasons there that you may not be able to accommodate on that request, and you're able to refuse it on that basis. Okay, there's also one at the end here. If you're reading through, a lot of this is about cost, pressure on existing staff or not being able to recruit. So for a Thursday afternoon, it would be reasonable to say it'd probably be pretty impossible to recruit someone just for one afternoon a week. So it would be an idea of why you might refuse this. But also, if there are planned structural changes happening, so for example, if you know, even if the employees aren't aware yet, that you are looking to perhaps sell the practice, or you are restructuring, which may result in redundancies, then that would be a planned structural change that you at this stage would be a reason a business could refuse a flexible working request, because you're not in a position to be able to say yes to it. Okay. So what happens if you do refuse a request? And again, I was explaining the biggest risk around that is linked to discrimination reasons. And what we see, the most common mistake is a failure to consider requests at all. And going back to what the legislation says, that employers must consider requests in a reasonable manner. So to have a blanket no, or to not even consider it, you are in breach of that legislation. And we do hear, sometimes we hear members, they'll call and say, well, our policy is that we do not consider anyone that wants to work less than 3 days a week. And it is the challenge. He goes, well, why? If you were challenging that in court, how would you justify that as a solid business reason? There are very few roles out there that can't be worked flexibly. And I think it's thinking about outside the box of how you do things. And I'm fully aware of the struggles that you come up against in practices when I speak to members. And I know that most have just enough staff that they need and not lots of surplus to requirements. But it's just at least consider them and work through the application process so you're coming to a fair conclusion. Failure to follow procedure, I think that's one that's always ends up being breached in any do with capability, disciplinary, or grievance. This comes up, and that tends to be around not accepting or dealing with the request in the 3-month time frame. That's the key period, or you're out remembering that it also includes the appeal stage as well. Also, not applying or even giving them a chance to allow a trial period is also an area that people can fall down on. I think, again, a common one that people forget to give employees is the appeal stage as well. Now, then I have put this one in here, and this is based on, again, lots of conversations and studies we've done over the last few years. We're talking to members. Finding yourself in a situation where you're accepting all requests is a common mistake. So I said earlier that when members receive a request, they're first, if I accept this one, I'll have to accept them all, otherwise they're going to complain, and you could easily end up in a situation where you're not following a process, and you think, oh, it's easier, or I have to accept every request that comes through. So we have situations of members who have, I think one in particular, 15 different part-time working arrangements going on in a small practice. And you have too many on a Tuesday, not enough on a Thursday. And it can become a real nightmare to manage. And that flexible working isn't about that. It is about obviously managing it well, but it has to work for the businesses in a way as well. And each flexible working request should be looked at on its own merit. So just because you've accepted one doesn't mean that the second request that comes through, even if it's very similar, is going to work for the business. So you have to look at them all case by case. Now, something that people may not be aware of is that the other area is, if someone has made a request, if one of your team members have made a request to an employer to change their working arrangements, and they then find they've had a blanket no, for example, and then they suspect they're being treated differently, that the employer maybe thinks they're not as committed to the role or as loyal or motivated, and they feel themselves perhaps missing out on opportunities, promotions, or being treated differently in any way. And this is where what's called detrimental treatment. And if that's linked to making a flexible working request, that can be, they obviously protected legally for that, and it could be seen as an automatically unfair reason. They could claim against you for that. So just be aware of that. So I know I'm talking a lot about risk in dealing with flexible working requests. I think it is because they are so bespoke. Each one is so different. So I was making you aware of this to try and mitigate those risks when you're dealing with them. So grievances can soon arise from team members who feel their flexible working request has not been handled properly. Or maybe they have had the blanket no, we don't consider flexible working under the 3 days a week situation. So you'll end up with grievances. The first stage is grievances coming from your team members and having to address those. I think the real damage, and sometimes you can't always quantify this, is the employer and employee relationship. If you're turning down a flexible working request without consideration or a blanket no, and they don't feel they've been treated well, they will end up leaving. And these are the quiet ones that you don't actually know the reason they've actually resigned. And they'll go quietly, not necessarily raise a grievance or constructive dismissal claim, but it means that you could potentially be losing a really good employee. So constructive dismissals, this will come from the more vocal of your employees that are really unhappy about their request being turned down. And they may feel that it's made their situation untenable, and they leave and resign because of it. And if they have 2 years of service with you, they would qualify to be able to make a constructive dismissal claim. Automatic unfair dismissal. Now this applies to any employees, irrelevant of their length of service, if they can prove that they have been unfairly dismissed for actually putting a flexible working request into their employer and applying for that. So they would be able to go to that. Now, compensation for employees who feel they have been treated unfairly for flexible working, or the flexible working policy and procedure has not been followed in the correct way, is 8 weeks' pay. And this is sort of capped at about £500 per week, which, yes, 8 weeks' pay is still not great, but tends to be coupled with discrimination claims on top, constructive dismissal, unfair dismissal, and those are the heavy-weighted areas that aren't capped and are expensive in terms of compensation. So it's really important to seek advice at every stage when you're in a refusal, dealing with any refusals in particular. Now, on the other side, just to reassure you that in tribunals, they will respect that employers have to think about their businesses as well. They won't always side on the part of the employee. They'll very much look at the process. Have you been fair? Have you considered this reasonably? Have you trialled it? That's what they'll look at. And it's not for them to judge what is working for your business. They just want to see that you've actually tried to work with the employee on this. Okay, so let's look at key policies and templates that we have on the iComply system. Now, the one I mentioned earlier, if you're in a good position that you're able to agree the changes straight away, then it's using the subsequent changes to terms and conditions. This is the template on iComply that we suggest you use to reflect any changes in an employee's working terms. So you complete this one. We also have the flexible working application policy on there, so please familiarise yourself with that. And I have put the Northern Ireland one on here. Now they still, Northern Ireland, they work under a separate part of legislation, and it is different time period is the key difference there. So if anybody likes advice from there, then please give us a call on the helpline. I'll talk you through that. I have allocated the grievance procedure because unfortunately this is an area that grievances arise from. And also an overview of family-friendly rights. As I mentioned earlier, predominantly the amount of flexible working requests still come from women. Now, because this is such a risky area, and because I mentioned earlier, each case or request that you receive should be judged on its own merits. We haven't got a template refusal letter on iComply purely because it's so, for you to just be able to send that letter off may expose you to a risk there. So that's why I advise our Total members that work with us, or if you're interested in Total HR membership, we will create those refusal letters with you, or a compromise, because they have to be individually created to meet each situation. Okay. So let's think about some actions that may help you minimise those risks of getting things wrong in this situation. I think the first thing is to make sure you are communicating your flexible working application to all your team members. And if you are have a sniff of anybody who says to you, I want to change my working hours, is to give them the application, make sure everybody is following that process. Make sure that when you do agree requests or temporary requests, that they are confirmed in writing and signed and kept in the employee's file. and handle all the requests within that 3-month time period, including the appeals, just to remember that ticking clock going on in the background when you're receiving a request through. Consider a trial period, a good idea, or compromise. You could give us a call on the helpline and we can even talk you through and talk ideas of thinking outside the box as well. And seek advice when refusing requests, especially those returning from maternity. But it's just to reassure that you don't have to accept every single request that comes through, even though you're nervous about it. And I know you can see the risks that are involved. But if you get the right advice, it will support you. And it's important to know it has to work for you as a business as well. So I mentioned the risk involved, and we do have the Total HR and Employment Law Service that has been set up from our members' request, and I can see there's some totals with us today, so thank you for that. The big thing about the service is that you will have that personal support. You'll be looked after by your own HR advisor as well, who will get to know you and your priorities, and you always have that support in the background, and particularly in dealing with flexible working requests in particular, they'll be able to support you through that process. Also, as part of this is your contracts will be set up with that, your handbooks. There are also annual audits, making sure that you've got all the documentation in place so you don't fall foul there. There is a really useful web application that comes with the package, and that will help you manage your staff sickness and absence, and even flexible working applications you can keep on here as well and see where you are with those. So it's really useful. Okay, if you are interested in our HR service, we have our professional services team available this afternoon, and also they're going to be at the Professional Dentistry Show tomorrow and Saturday. So if you'd like to pop along and see them, they might even be able to show you even more about their Total HR service with the application, give you a demo of that, and also talk to you about our other services, iComply and QPS as well. Now, those of you that know Alex, our compliance manager, he's also doing a talk at the dentistry show, so you can go and see him as well. So in a couple of weeks' time, we have Sophie, who's going to be doing our next webinar on the 28th of February, and this is disability and reasonable adjustments. So it's going to be quite a useful one. It's again one that we know members struggle with, so it's something we thought would be really helpful. And then we have our compliance update day in Birmingham coming up on the 3rd of May. If you want to book any of these, then you can do that on our website. Now, just going back to the webinars, what we would really like to do is our last webinar of the HR series, we were doing 10 altogether, is on the 28th of March. And what we would like to do is give our members and those attending the webinars the option to choose a subject that they have an interest in and really need some help with. So we'll have some more information on that on the 28th of February and give you those choices.